The office building stood silent under the glow of city lights, its polished floors reflecting the faint shimmer of street lamps outside. Most nights, the only sounds were the hum of distant elevators and the soft swish of a mop gliding across tile. That sound belonged to Ethan Brooks, a quiet man who had been cleaning these halls for years. He never drew attention to himself. His uniform was plain, his steps light, his presence almost invisible to the people who worked there during the day. Yet, there was a quiet kindness about him that no one seemed to notice, except for one woman. Every Thursday night, Ethan would place a cup of chamomile tea, exactly how she liked it, just outside the glass door of the CEO's office. Clara Evans, a young widow and the company's driven, composed leader, often worked late into the night. Most people saw her as untouchable, powerful, graceful, and always in control. Ethan, however, saw someone else, a woman who stayed long after everyone had gone home, her light burning in an empty office as if she was too tired to return to an even lonelier house. That night began like any other. Ethan pushed his cart down the long corridor, mop in hand, his movements steady and practiced. He was halfway across the polished tile when he froze. Clara was there, barefoot, standing at the doorway of her office, framed by the warm amber light behind her. She wasn't the untouchable CEO in a power suit. Instead, she wore a soft midnight blue dress that draped effortlessly over her frame. Her hair was loose, and in her hands she held a simple ceramic mug, cradling it as though it was the only warmth she had left. Ethan felt his grip tighten on the mop handle. She had never spoken to him beyond polite greetings, and he hadn't expected to see her tonight. Yet Clara stepped closer, her voice low but steady, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Do you think we could start right here?" The words hung in the hallway like something fragile and forbidden, drifting between them. Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. He had spent years blending into the background, fixing things no one noticed, cleaning up messes nobody thanked him for. And yet here she was, Clara Evans, the woman who commanded boardrooms and led hundreds of employees, looking at him as though she truly saw him for the first time. In that quiet space, everything felt different. The polished corridor, usually a place where people hurried past without glancing his way, suddenly felt smaller, warmer, as if it had been holding its breath for this exact moment. Clara didn't look rushed or guarded. There was a softness in her eyes, one that hinted at exhaustion, but also a quiet strength, the kind that comes from surviving loss and learning to keep walking anyway. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words didn't come easily to him, especially when it came to people like Clara. He wasn't supposed to talk to tenants beyond small talk. He wasn't supposed to be seen. And yet, she stood there, waiting, as if she had chosen this exact moment for a reason neither of them fully understood. Sometimes, life pivots on moments that feel too small to matter. A single act of kindness, a glance that lingers too long, a question asked softly but with meaning. For Ethan and Clara, this was one of those moments. What would follow from that single question was something no one in that building could have predicted. It wouldn't just be a story about love or chance encounters. It would become a story about courage, about refusing to let the world decide who belongs and who doesn't. Sometimes, a single kind gesture can change everything. If this story already touches you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts to support our channel. In the weeks that followed, nothing seemed different on the surface. Ethan still arrived each night at 9, his cart rattling softly across the marble floor, and Clara still stayed late, her office light glowing like a beacon in an otherwise empty building. Yet between them, something had shifted. Their conversations started as brief exchanges, a thank you for the tea, a quiet comment about the weather, a passing observation about the city skyline, but soon grew into something deeper. There was never a confession, never a dramatic declaration of love. Instead, it was the kind of connection built quietly, like two people meeting in the middle of a long, lonely road. Clara would sometimes sit on the edge of her desk as Ethan finished his rounds, asking him about the places he'd worked before, about the books he liked to read, about his mother who'd taught him to fix lamps when their landlord wouldn't. In return, she shared pieces of herself that she rarely offered to anyone else. The weight of widowhood, the way leadership sometimes felt like a mask that never came off, the loneliness of being admired but rarely understood. It was innocent, honest, and exactly what both of them needed. But buildings like theirs had walls that seemed to carry whispers better than sound. One blurry photo was all it took. A grainy shot of Ethan handing Clara a cup of tea in her doorway, the caption on Slack reading, "Looks like CEO Evans has a new after-hours advisor." By noon the next day, the post was deleted, but not before it had been screenshotted, shared, and dissected in break rooms and private chats across the company. The words followed them like a shadow. The CEO and the janitor? The tone was never curious. It was mocking, laced with disbelief, like they had stepped out of line in a way people couldn't wait to judge. Clara began to notice the stares during meetings, the half-smiles exchanged between colleagues when she entered the room. Even Ethan, who had long since learned to blend into the background, felt the shift. The way some employees suddenly fell silent when he passed by, the way others looked at him too long, as though daring him to meet their eyes. It wasn't just gossip. It was about class, race, and the unspoken rules that dictated who was allowed to belong where. Clara was a wealthy white CEO, poised and polished, while Ethan was a black man in a uniform carrying a mop. To people on the outside, their connection wasn't just unusual, it was unacceptable. Among those watching closely was Victor Langston, a powerful real estate mogul whose influence stretched across the city. For years, he had been quietly buying up black-owned businesses in historically diverse neighborhoods, revitalizing them into luxury developments that catered to people who looked nothing like the original residents. Victor's interest in Clara's company had been minimal, until now. Her success and rising visibility, especially after she partnered with several local community programs, put her in a spotlight he didn't like. A CEO like Clara, with her growing reputation for integrity and independence, was a threat to his long-term plans. And her quiet connection with Ethan, a man Victor would never see as an equal, was the perfect crack to exploit. The whispers became louder. Some called Ethan a charity case. Others framed Clara as unprofessional, reckless, and distracted. And then came the meeting with HR. The director, a woman with a carefully neutral tone, invited Clara to discuss appropriate professional boundaries with staff. "We've had some concerns raised," she began, her hands folded neatly on the table. "As a leader, it's important to consider how these interactions might be perceived." Clara leaned back in her chair, expression calm but sharp. "Are these concerns about tea?" she asked coolly, "or about skin tone?" The director blinked, taken aback. "I don't think it's appropriate to frame it that way." "Then maybe you're not listening closely enough." The conversation ended quickly after that, but Clara knew exactly what it meant. Her choices, both personal and professional, were now under a microscope. And while she had spent years perfecting the art of being unshakable, something about the way Ethan was being talked about, like he was invisible, like his worth was up for debate, cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Ethan noticed the change too. That night, when Clara didn't wait by her door as usual, he slowed his cart outside her office, unsure whether to knock. The door was closed, the light off. He set a cup of tea gently on the floor and moved on, his chest heavy with something he couldn't name. The next few nights were the same. No tea waiting inside, no warm glow spilling from her doorway. For the first time, Ethan realized just how fragile their quiet routine had been, how easily it could be fractured by the weight of other people's opinions. And far away, in an office lined with expensive art and polished oak furniture, Victor Langston smiled as he scanned the latest market report. He could see the cracks forming. To men like him, integrity was just another thing to buy out, and people like Ethan, people who quietly built without asking for permission, were nothing more than obstacles waiting to be removed. The walls of that office building no longer simply whispered. They judged, they watched, and they reminded Ethan and Clara that the world rarely forgave those who stepped outside the lines it had drawn for them. Clara had never been one to retreat, and Ethan had spent his entire life learning how to stand steady in storms. So when whispers turned into outright judgment, they didn't back away. They built something new. The idea came late one night as Clara sat in her office, her heels kicked off, her hair pulled loose from its tight bun. Ethan had just finished mopping the floor outside her door, and instead of leaving quietly as usual, he stepped inside with 2 cups of tea. "You always clean up after everyone," she said softly. "But what if we built something together, something that doesn't need permission to exist?" That was how Evans and Brooks Studio was born. A modest space downtown with a garage door that rolled up to the street. One side became a design studio for Clara's projects. The other was a workshop where Ethan and two of his old friends, Devin and Jalen, both skilled tradesmen who'd been struggling to find meaningful work, fixed whatever people brought in. Leaky faucets, broken chairs, busted lamps. Nothing was too small. They didn't advertise at first. Instead, Clara handwrote a flyer and taped it to the coffee shop window across the street. Fix-It Day, free minor repairs for seniors, veterans, and single parents. No questions asked. Come with a story or don't. Just come. On the first Saturday, 5 people showed up. By the third weekend, there was a line. Children began gathering near the workshop too, curious about the tools and the bright paint stacked in the corner. Clara, once known for her sleek office style and high-profile meetings, rolled up her sleeves and started teaching the kids to paint. Walls, old furniture, whatever they could find. One afternoon, a boy named Malik timidly picked up a paintbrush. He rarely spoke in class, his mother explained. But that day, surrounded by color and music, he began to hum softly to himself as he painted. By the end of the day, he whispered his first full sentence in weeks. Those moments reminded Ethan and Clara why they had started. This wasn't about defiance for its own sake. It was about creating a place where people felt seen. A mural soon began to take shape on the studio wall, designed by Clara but brought to life by dozens of hands, children, neighbors, even retirees who hadn't painted in decades. 2 hands, one dark, one light, stretched toward each other, building a bridge out of scraps of wood, bolts, and color. But success has a way of drawing out opposition. Victor Langston took notice when the studio's story began spreading online. Photos of the mural and clips of Ethan patiently teaching a group of kids how to sandwood gained traction, and soon, local blogs and news outlets began covering their community-first model. To Victor, it was a problem. Evans and Brooks' studio sat on land he'd been eyeing for months, part of a block he intended to purchase and redevelop into luxury lofts. A thriving, beloved community space didn't fit into those plans. The first offer came politely, an envelope with a figure that could have made Clara comfortable for years. She tossed it straight into the trash. The second approach was subtler, online rumors questioning Clara's professionalism, anonymous comments framing Ethan as a charity case, even whispers about whether their studio was just for show. And then came the trap. One evening, Ethan caught a man spraying black paint across the side of the mural. He approached calmly, telling him to stop. The man swung first, fists clenched, but it was Ethan who was arrested. Clara arrived at the precinct furious, her composure unshaken as she demanded an explanation. There were no charges, only vague language about threatening behavior. Ethan sat quietly, his hands folded on the table, his jaw tight. He'd seen this before, how quickly assumptions could become accusations when someone looked like him. The very next day, Clara published an open letter on her company's website. It wasn't long or dramatic. It simply spoke of kindness, fairness, and the right to be seen for who we are rather than what the world assumes. If a black man handing a white woman a cup of tea still causes outrage in 2025, she wrote, perhaps the problem is not with us, but with the lens we refuse to clean. The letter went viral. Local blogs picked it up, then design magazines, then late-night talk shows quoted it on air. Messages flooded in, some supportive, some cruel. Victor saw the shift and doubled down. The studio's business account was suddenly frozen due to a random audit. A letter arrived from an acquisition firm offering a final chance to sell the property. Grainy photos of Clara and Ethan, him holding her hand as they painted, her laughing beside him, were slipped anonymously under her apartment door. "You're being watched," the note read. Clara stared at the photos for a long time that night, her hands trembling slightly before she set them down. "They want us rattled," Ethan said when she showed him. "And it's working," she whispered. "Only if we let it." Even with the mounting pressure, the studio doors still rolled open every Saturday. More people came. A retired mechanic donated his old tools. A teacher brought her class to paint. Miss Eleanor, an 81-year-old with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, arrived in her wheelchair and announced, "I came to fix something too, your spirits." Each week, the mural grew brighter. The black paint that had been sprayed in anger was transformed into new shapes, silhouettes, shadows, contrast that made the colors stand out even more. The studio had become more than just a building. It was proof that acts of kindness, however small, could grow into something powerful. But for Victor Langston, The more the studio thrived, the greater the threat it posed to his plans. And when quiet intimidation failed, he began preparing for something bigger, something that would test just how much Clara and Ethan were willing to risk for what they had built. The threats, the frozen bank accounts, the anonymous photos, they all pointed to one thing. Victor Langston wanted them gone. But instead of retaliating with anger or fear, Clara and Ethan chose a different response. They decided to answer hostility with something more powerful: kindness. Clara sat at the studio's worn wooden desk late one night drafting a simple flyer. In bold letters across the top, she wrote, "Fix It Day, free repairs for our community." Beneath it, she added, "Bring what's broken, bring your stories, or just bring yourself. No charge, no judgment." The next morning, they taped the flyer to the coffee shop window again, just like the very first time. They posted it online too, tagging local nonprofits and neighborhood groups. Then Clara made one more call to a reporter from a community podcast who had previously covered their mural story. "If you want to see what this studio is really about," she said, "come Saturday, just watch." When Saturday came, the line outside the studio stretched down the block. Children tugged on their parents' hands, veterans leaned on canes, single mothers balanced toddlers on their hips. Inside, the garage-style door was rolled up, music played softly, and Ethan stood in the center of the workshop, ready with a toolbox and an easy smile. The first to speak was a veteran named Mr. Carter, who had served in 2 wars and returned home to find himself without purpose. As Ethan fixed the old radio he had carried in, a relic from his father, Mr. Carter's voice cracked as he said, "You didn't just fix my radio today. You reminded me that I still matter to someone." Next came Malik, the quiet boy who had once barely spoken. His mother brought him back to paint while Ethan worked on repairing a wobbly chair. Malik picked up a brush, dipped it in bright yellow, and started humming again. And then, as everyone stood watching, he turned to his mom and said clearly, "Look, Mama, my chair's fixed." His mother cried softly, covering her mouth as the room fell silent. Even Miss Eleanor, the sharp-tongued 81-year-old, rolled in with a broken space heater. When Ethan handed it back to her working perfectly, she patted his arm and said, "Son, you didn't just warm my house, you warmed my heart." Each story was filmed and recorded by the podcast crew, who asked Clara why they continued despite the backlash. She smiled, her voice steady. "Because people deserve to feel safe where they live and seen where they stand. This isn't about business, it's about community. And no one should have to apologize for building that." By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, the studio was buzzing with laughter, paint-splattered hands, and repaired memories. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other shared coffee and stories. Kids ran around with smudges of color on their cheeks. It felt less like a workshop and more like a family gathering, one that everyone had been missing without even realizing it. And for Clara, as she watched Ethan laugh with Devin and Jalen while helping a young girl tighten the wheels on her brother's wheelchair, she understood something deeply. Ethan was not just the man who fixed things. He was the quiet spark that lit hope in others, the kind of person who reminded people that they mattered, not because of titles or wealth, but because kindness itself was powerful. When the podcast episode aired the next week, it wasn't explosive or sensational. It was honest. Clips of veterans hugging Ethan, children painting the mural, and Clara speaking plainly about why the studio existed began circulating online. The story resonated. Messages poured in, letters from retired mechanics offering old tools, from teachers wanting to bring their students, from families saying the studio reminded them what community used to feel like. Victor Langston saw it all, and his frustration grew. His final offer came with a cold precision, a letter on expensive stationery, promising a payout large enough to erase every debt Clara had ever known. "Sell now or be gone in 30 days, it read. Clara held the letter in her hands that night, staring at the number printed in neat black ink. It could pay off her late husband's medical bills. It could give her comfort for years. But accepting it would mean silence. It would mean erasing everything they had built together. She folded the letter neatly and dropped it into the trash. That evening, she found Ethan out back, rolling paint across a wooden panel for the next mural piece. He glanced at her and said simply, "They're still trying to bury us." "And they don't know," she replied softly, picking up a brush, "where the roots are." The next Fix-It Day drew even more people, so many that volunteers began setting up chairs in the alley for those waiting. a local church brought hot meals. A teacher handed out sketch pads to the children, and when reporters came back with cameras, Clara didn't hide. She stood next to Ethan as they spoke openly about why they refused to give in. "We don't build for applause," Clara said to the crowd and cameras alike. "We build because people deserve to know they matter. We build because we're tired of waiting for permission to belong." Ethan stood beside her, his voice steady but warm. "I used to walk past places like this and wonder if anyone even knew I was there. But one night, Clara left the lights on, and I realized that sometimes being seen is enough to start something worth fighting for." The crowd erupted in applause, not the loud, performative kind, but the steady, heartfelt clapping of people who understood. They weren't just witnessing a studio fixing broken objects. They were witnessing a community choosing to fix itself, piece by piece. The podcast crew released a follow-up video calling Evans and Brooks Studio a quiet revolution built on kindness. Within days, donations began pouring in. Paint, tools, supplies, sent from people across the city who had never even visited but believed in what they were doing. And still, Victor pushed harder. Anonymous letters arrived with veiled threats. Clara and Ethan found more grainy photos slipped under their door. Yet each act of intimidation only seemed to fuel the studio's resolve, because Clara had finally realized what made Ethan extraordinary. He wasn't a man who needed saving. He was a man who quietly saved others every single day, not by fixing things, but by teaching people that kindness itself could rebuild what the world had tried to break. That was the true power Victor Langston could never understand. And it was the very thing he could never erase, because what they had built wasn't just a studio. It was hope, and hope had a way of outlasting everything. The tension finally reached its peak when Victor Langston walked into City Hall flanked by a team of lawyers, each one carrying thick binders and wearing the same smug confidence. The room fell quiet as he approached the front, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. His presence carried a weight that made people instinctively sit straighter, as though money itself had just entered the room. Victor scanned the crowd with a faint, knowing smile, the kind of smile worn by a man who had spent his life believing everything and everyone had a price. He took a deliberate pause before speaking, letting the silence work for him. It wasn't just about what he would say, it was about reminding everyone that he expected to be heard, obeyed, and feared. 30 days, he announced smoothly, his tone controlled, rehearsed. That is all the time you have left. After that, this property will be cleared. No exceptions, no appeals. I'm giving you an opportunity to step aside gracefully. Gasps rippled softly through the audience. Parents held their children closer. A veteran in the back clenched his fists. Victor glanced around, clearly savoring the moment. To him, this wasn't just business. It was conquest. He thrived on watching hope flicker in people's eyes before it finally went out. As he adjusted his cufflinks, one of his lawyers placed a neatly bound document on the table in front of the council. Our client's proposal stands to increase the city's tax revenue by 30% in the next fiscal year, the lawyer added crisply. This block will become a hub of progress and prosperity if outdated, inefficient ventures like Evans and Brooks Studio are removed. Victor didn't even look at Clara and Ethan. To him, they weren't opponents. They were obstacles, small ones he expected to crush without effort. But as he finally met Clara's gaze, his smirk faltered just slightly, because what he saw in her eyes wasn't fear. It was fire. You have 30 days, Victor announced smoothly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from years of always getting his way. After that, this property will be cleared. Consider this your final courtesy notice. Clara stood tall, her shoulders squared, Ethan steady at her side. Neither of them flinched. Instead, Clara glanced toward the rows of seats behind them, where dozens of familiar faces waited. Veterans in worn jackets, single mothers clutching their children's hands, elderly neighbors with canes and walkers, young tradesmen with rough, calloused hands. Even Malik, the quiet boy who had found his voice, sat proudly holding a sketch of the mural. When the hearing began, Victor's lawyers spoke first. Their words were smooth, practiced, full of promises about job creation and economic growth. They painted Evans and Brooks Studio as an inefficient use of valuable property, a sentimental holdout in a city that needed progress. Then Clara rose to speak. She didn't have slides, notes, or legal jargon. She simply stepped to the podium and told the truth. "This isn't just a building," she said clearly, her voice steady enough to cut through the murmurs. "It's where veterans come to feel useful again, where children discover color and courage, where single parents find help without shame. It's where kindness is treated as power, not weakness. And if that isn't progress, then maybe we've all forgotten what community is supposed to mean." One by one, people stood beside her. Mr. Carter, the veteran, placed his hand on the podium and said, "These people didn't just fix my radio. They fixed something in me that I thought was gone." Malik's mother wiped tears as she explained how her son had spoken again for the first time in years. "This studio gave my child a voice. I can't put a price on that." Miss Eleanor wheeled herself forward, her voice sharp as ever. "I've lived in this neighborhood 81 years. Developers like Mr. Langston come and go, but this place, it's the first thing in decades that feels like home again. Every story stacked upon the last like bricks, building something stronger than any legal argument. By the time the final speaker sat down, the room was silent. Even Victor's smirk had faded. The council recessed to deliberate. There would be no decision until Monday. Clara and Ethan stepped outside into the crisp night air, their breaths clouding as they looked up at the mural glowing softly under the streetlight. Someone had vandalized it again. Black paint streaked across the bright colors, dripping down like fresh wounds. Clara stared at the damage, her chest tightening. Then she turned to Ethan. "They want to bury us," she whispered. Ethan looked at the wall, then back at her, eyes steady. "Then we'll grow roots deeper than they can dig." They didn't wait until morning. Under the glow of string lights strung hastily across the alley, they began repainting. Each dark smear became a new detail, a shadow that made the colors shine even brighter. Neighbors trickled in with brushes, rollers, and paint cans. Children laughed as they added stars and flowers. Someone brought a guitar, another tapped a steady rhythm on a bucket. Before long, voices rose in soft harmony. Old hymns, freedom songs, tunes people hadn't sung in years but still remembered by heart. The mural transformed again, stronger and more vibrant than before. It was no longer just two hands building a bridge. Now, faint silhouettes appeared in the background, representing the community itself, everyone who had chosen to stand together. By midnight, Clara leaned against the wall, her clothes flecked with paint, her hair falling loose around her face. Ethan stood beside her, his arm brushing lightly against hers as he put down his roller. They didn't speak for a while. There was no need. When they finally stepped back, the mural glowed in the dim light, a testament not to defiance, but to resilience. "They may still win," Clara said quietly. "Maybe," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "But not tonight. Tonight, we chose not to hide." The weekend passed slowly. Rain fell steadily over the city, making the streets shine like silver threads. Inside the studio, Clara kept busy, rearranging tools and cleaning brushes, while Ethan repaired a broken stool someone had left behind. Neither of them spoke much about Monday, but every time their eyes met, there was the same unspoken truth. They would face whatever came next together. On Monday morning, City Hall would reveal its decision. Until then, the mural stood bright against the gray sky, a bridge built not just of paint and wood, but of people. Ordinary people who had refused to stay small. Sometimes the most powerful stand we can take is simply choosing not to hide. What would you do if you were in their place? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to support more stories like this.